And welcome everyone to the second and last of our Writers Speak events for this semester. A big thank you to you all for being here, and to the director, Sunil Amrith, and executive director, Steve Beal at the Mahindra Humanities Center for supporting this series. Special thanks to Lauren Doan, who makes everything possible, and thanks also to the Harvard Bookstore, who are here this evening so that you can purchase Hisham Matar's wonderful books and have them signed by the author after the event, I will say expeditiously, as he has a plane to catch. It was alive, and then suddenly it was not. The animal kicked furiously, snorting for air, which entered its nostrils and escaped through the open neck. The blood poured out black and thick like date syrup. Small, translucent bubbles grew and burst around its mouth. I snapped my fingers. I clapped my hands beside its wide-open eye. When it did not respond, I began to cry. I went back when the corpse was headless, skinned, and hanging from a pole. The layer of fat around the body was thin and luminous as a veil of clouds at dusk. This is Hisham Matar's description of witnessing as a child the slaughter of a sheep. It renders the experience utterly vivid to us, his readers, as if we had lived it ourselves. He makes of words themselves a luminous veil, a translation of experience that proves indelible. As Horatio Clare wrote in the UK magazine The Spectator, Hisham Matar is an observer and listener of enormous subtlety and sensitivity, and he writes English prose as cleanly and clearly as it can be written. Many here will already be familiar with Hisham's oeuvre, his two remarkable novels, his debut in The Country of Men, published in 2006, was a finalist for the Booker Prize, the National Book Critics Circle Prize, and the Guardian First Book Award, and won the Royal Society of Literature Ondaatje Prize, as well as many international honors. And his second novel, Anatomy of a Disappearance, published in 2011, was named a Best Book of the Year by many journals here and abroad, including The Guardian, The Irish Times, the Chicago Tribune. Of it, Robert Worth wrote in the New York Times that it is studded with little jewels of perception, deft metaphors and details that illuminate character or set a scene. His extraordinary memoir, and I don't use that in a everyday way. I use that in the way it is meant. His extraordinary memoir, The Return, published in 2016, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, the LA Times Book Prize, and won the Pulitzer Prize for Biography and the Penn Gene Stein Book Award. It was also named one of the New York Times 10 Best Books of the Year. All three books circle around a central narrative of Hisham Matar's life. The loss of his father, Jabala Matar, a Libyan activist and dissident who, living in exile in Cairo, battled the Gaddafi regime for many years. In 1990, when Hisham was 19 and a student in London, his father was abducted in Cairo by the Egyptian secret police and handed over to the Gaddafi regime. He was imprisoned in the notorious Abu Salim prison, as were two of Hisham's uncles and two of his cousins, and his fate was unknown. In 2012, after the fall of Gaddafi, Hisham returned to Libya for the first time to attempt to find out what had happened to his father. The resulting account is, as Colm Toybin has written, likely to become a classic, not only because of the extraordinary, riveting, and urgent nature of his experiences themselves, but also because of Hisham's wise and searching gaze, the honesty and profundity of his meditation upon those experiences. When you read his work, you find yourself nodding and muttering agreement, underlining entire paragraphs, dog-earing page after page. There's a quality of Greek myth in Hisham's work. He writes intensely, intimately, and universally about what it's like to be alive. There are abiding themes in all his books, but his new one, A Month in Siena, also represents a departure. It's the account of Hisham's solitary sojourn in that city, Siena, and of the discoveries, artistic, emotional, and intellectual, to which it gave rise. My copy, only about a week old, is no less dog-eared and underlined than are my other Matar books, but this brief rumination upon his pilgrimage to that city and its extraordinary artworks is a testament to the aftermath of loss and grief, an illumination of art's power to knit us into life. He writes, quote, "In the end, as it is in the beginning, love and art are an expression of faith. How else to function with the limited knowledge we have?" Asked if he was a pessimist, the English playwright Edward Bond replied, "Why am I talking to you if it is not a gesture of hope?" Lorenzetti's Allegory, Caravaggio's David, and indeed the entire history of art can be read as that, a gesture of hope and also of desire, a playing out of the human spirit's secret ambition to connect with the beloved, to see the world through her eyes, to traverse that tragic private distance between intention and utterance so that finally we might be truly comprehended. And to do this not in order to advocate a position, but rather to be truly seen, to be recognized, not to be mistaken for someone else, to go on changing while remaining identifiable by those who know us best. The possibility, that was all Hisham, of course. The possibility of recognition is available to each of us in our relationship to art. In reading Hisham's work, or in reading Tolstoy or Joseph Conrad, or in standing in Siena in front of Lorenzetti's extraordinary 14th century paintings, any one of us may find ourselves truly seen. As Hisham wisely observes, only love and art can do this. Only inside a book or in front of a painting can one truly be let into another's perspective. It has always struck me as a paradox how in the solitary arts there is something intimately communal. How fortunate we are to commune with Hisham Matar this evening, visiting from New York City, where he is an associate professor of the practice in comparative literature, Asia and Middle Eastern cultures, comparative literature and English. It's a lot. At Barnard College at Columbia University, as well as the founder and principal curator of the Barnard International Artists Series. Please join me in welcoming our guest.
Thank you so much, Claire. I'm moved by this introduction, also not in an ordinary way. And also, Claire, maybe we should have exchanged notes before, but maybe it's better that we didn't also, because you picked out several of the lines that I was planning to read. And I think maybe as I'm progressively starting to think that there is no such thing as reading, there's only rereading, and so maybe it's appropriate that you'll hear them again. The section that I'm going to read you is not focused on Siena. So maybe, but it is a moment when, early on in my month in Siena, Diana and I are at the Diana, my wife, and myself are at the Sale di Nove in the Civic Palace in Siena, and we're standing in front of this painting, which I'm sure is familiar to most of you, the allegory of good government. It's called, and just to give you a sense of its scale, it's about 8 meters across. Now I'm going to lose everybody speaking with meters, but yeah, it's a yard and a meter almost. Yeah, so 8 yards across. Thank you, 8 yards across. So, and that is the short side of the room. The room is rectangular. The long side is 14.5 meters. You have this in the middle, which is the allegory of good government, and then you have to one side of it the effects of good government. So if you were to follow this, how the world would look like. And then you have the effects of bad government on the other side. Lorenzetti was commissioned to, there are 2 Lorenzettis, of course, the brothers. This is Ambrogio Lorenzetti. He was commissioned to do this in 1338 by the magistrates that meet in this Hall of the Nine, the Salle di Nove, or sometimes called Salle di Pesce, the Hall of Peace, as a kind of altarpiece of good governance. Right? It's a hymn to secular rule. Just to very quickly sort of help you organize it. Right at the top, you have, that's the highest level, you have wisdom, faith, charity, and hope floating, suspended, as it were. And then that's the highest level. Then the middle level is where the virtues are. And they're organized on either side of the common good, that elderly figure with the old beard that we can't somehow escape in our history. To the left of the common good sits justice. So justice is here, right, way at the left here on the throne, handing out her verdicts. And then that figure in white, leaning on those black things aren't pillows, they're armor, right? So she's peace, and in the presence of peace, there's no need for armor, no need for war. And then we have fortitude next to peace and prudence, then the figure of common good, and then after that we have magnanimity, temperance, and then the painting ends again with justice. So justice brackets the painting. The justice on the left weaves the two threads, sending them down to Concord, who's sitting, the leveler, right? Concord the leveler, sitting on the left, and she weaves the threads into a rope, handing it to the citizenry, those figures, who then pass it back to the common good. So that's sort of the logic of the painting. And I was, the reason I'm showing you this here is because at that moment when I was looking at it, I was struck by a resemblance between justice. You could barely see it, it's a bit cut off actually, but justice at the right here has a decapitated head on her lap. And the face of that head and the face of justice somehow got under my skin. And it reminded me of another painting. So you have to imagine the scene. We're standing in this room looking at this painting. And I am reminded of another moment and another painting. And the passage somehow tries to hold all of those things together, all those moments together, the passage that I'm about to read you. The likeness of justice and of the decapitated head resting on her lap reminded me of another painting that Diana and I had seen a couple of years earlier in Rome. As we stood in the Salle di Nove, impressions from that day returned to me with peculiar vividness. We had been to see Caravaggio's David with the head of Goliath in the Galleria Borghese, then wandered through the streets in silence, together but each occupied by our own thoughts. It was late spring. The Roman sun was out. Around noon we looked for shade. Diana spotted a green beside the Sant'Andrea al Quirinale. We lay under the canopy of a high pine. The grass was cool and accepting against my back. My head was now lower than my chest, and I could feel the blood gather between the temples. Diana lay beside me, resting her head on my chest. I remember getting that odd feeling, a sort of mystery toward my own anatomy, not entirely certain of what was contained beneath my ribcage. I felt then what I felt now, standing in the Salle di Nove, that an independent will operated these secret clocks inside of me, that the operations in every texture of my organs and the blood that ran through them belonged to some other order of existence that stood apart from my sense of myself, from my ideas and emotions. "I have such a beautiful perspective," Diana suddenly said. I continued looking at the canopy of the pine tree stretching above, the blue sky beyond it. I did not wish to be distracted from my view or try to imagine another. Besides, it was impossible to know hers, to see exactly what she was seeing. It would always be an approximation. My mind went to a conversation I had recently had with an old friend back in Tripoli, where Diana and I had been some days before going to Rome, about how desire, its continuum, is reliant on yearning, on the unfulfilled wish, the frustrated appetite. As my friend spoke, he and I walked at night through the city of my boyhood, some of its buildings damaged by the recent revolution and the civil conflict that had followed it. I was, in other words, back in my old and known city, and yet finding myself in an entirely new and changed place. Desire, my friend continued, dies the moment it achieves its end. What keeps our passion for anyone or anything alive is the promise of attainment. In other words, my friend continued with that air of confidence that I had not always tolerated during our youth, but that I now cherished. There is a contradiction between what desire wants, complete conquest, and what it needs in order to continue to exist, mystery, the unknowable. Desire is that animal that remains fit only through undernourishment. In evolutionary terms, my friend went on, failure is its prerequisite, frustration its generator. As compellingly delivered as it was, I had misgivings about my friend's thesis, but I was taking too much delight in his enthusiasm, in his abstractions and exaggerations to mind. And hadn't we always done this in our childhood? Spent hours slinging pebbles at the stars, knowing full well that, even before we fired them, the stones would fall right back, and probably on our own heads. And isn't this the way one must surely live, for all time? That the true pleasure is not in hitting the target, but in aiming at it. So I thought to encourage my friend further in his ruminations on the nature of desire by recounting to him a scene from Joseph Conrad's The Secret Agent. Adolf Verloc's cover is blown. The secret political agent's wife, Winnie, confronted with her husband's true identity and the tragic consequences of his actions, which have caused the death of her younger brother, is inconsolable. Her equable soul, as Conrad describes it, had been knocked off kilter, and the sentiment, which up to this point she had felt profoundly, quote, that things don't stand much looking into, end of quote, is no longer sustainable. The truth, at once horrible and unavoidable, stifles Winnie. She does not ask questions. She neither rebukes nor inquires. She is acting out of pure pain, but perhaps also strategically, knowing that engaging her husband in any way stands the risk of consolation. Instead, she becomes impenetrable, a blank page. And this bewilders Verloc greatly because curiosity being one of the forms of self-revelation, Conrad writes, a systematically incurious person remains always partly mysterious. It is a moment of deep desire between husband and wife, perhaps the most passionate one in the whole novel. It is when Verloc realizes that Winnie's unquestioning nature, which had helped him conceal his true identity from her, has also been working on him, making him, strangely, more in need of her. My friend, not being familiar with The Secret Agent, wanted to know more about the book. We were, or so it seemed that night in Tripoli, old childhood friends who, after 3 decades of being apart, of communicating only through telephone and letters, then email and text messages, were now sharing with the full-heartedness of rescued stowaways or vagabonds what precious stones the years had gathered in our pockets. He vowed to read the book, and I vowed to get him a copy. I did not tell him how the novel ends. I said nothing about the tragic fall of Verloc, the man who, after living a double life, still believed he could be loved for himself. The distance between where we stood now in Siena, in front of Lorenzetti's allegory of good government, and that moment a couple of years before when Diana and I had landed in Rome from Tripoli in the wake of my momentous return to my country after more than 3 decades of exile, a period of time in which I became a man, and perhaps a different kind of man from that other one I might have been had I remained in Libya. And the hours after seeing David with the head of Goliath in the Galleria Borghese, searching for shade and finding a place to rest under a pine on a green beside the Sant'Andrea al Quirinale, all seemed to fall together and collapse like a concertina of days made of the same fabric. Here we were in Siena, Rome, and Tripoli, all at once. And here we were looking at the faces of Lorenzetti's Justice and her victim, as well as those of Caravaggio and Goliath. I remembered how, on the grass in Rome, I had touched Diana's hair, which had fanned out behind her and across my chest. I remember how strange it was then to think that she had no way of knowing that my fingers were in her hair. I thought of our time in Libya, of when we had stopped just like this in search of shade under the arch of Marcus Aurelius in Tripoli only a few days before. I remembered how, when we had finally come away from the white sun and into the arch, the shade felt surprisingly cold and wet, and Marcus Aurelius's words which I had forgotten or neglected up to then to recall, had come to my mind. Love this, to which thou returnest. And for a moment I thought of speaking them out loud, but then, for reasons I still do not know, I did not. On that same day in Rome, as we lay on the grass, poets were gathering under the arch of Marcus Aurelius for Libya's first international poetry festival. I should have gone, I thought to myself, looking up at the pine tree. Why am I not there? Yet, somehow, there was the odd conviction that I was in the right place, that here was the center of my life, lying with Diana on the green next to the Sant'Andrea al Quirinale. She was breathing long and calmly, but I knew she was awake. Looking at the view above, which had probably changed a little, or as she shifted to make herself more comfortable, or had deepened as it became more intimate. I felt grateful for knowing her for so long, for sharing my waking and sleeping hours with her for nearly half of my life, for being loved for myself and able to love her for herself. It's the sort of gratitude one can never express. It certainly can never be spoken, and possibly not even written. I wondered how this picture, Lorenzetti's allegory of good government, appeared to her. I thought of what she had said in Rome as we lay on the green, "I have such a beautiful perspective." She has said these words, or words similar to them, before in other cities, but how appropriate, I thought now, surrounded by Lorenzetti's political purpose, to have said them on that day in Rome, not only because on that same day 30 or so poets from around the world were gathering in Tripoli, and so my mind was constantly veering there, but also because we had spent most of that morning in the Galleria Borghese, standing silently in front of Caravaggio's David with the head of Goliath. Looking at the curiously tragic, almost regretful expression on David's face as he considers his prize, the mammoth, clumsy, and bodiless head he is holding at the end of his outstretched arm, as though worrying he might dirty himself, the giant's hair almost slipping through his delicate fist. Goliath's old eyes stare into the distance, shocked, doubtful, as if caught inside a dream, or the opposite, woken up by death from the sedative cycle of the days. Whatever it may be, he is looking at something we cannot see and have never seen. We are looking at David look at Goliath, this is clear, but what remains unknown and unknowable is what Goliath is looking at. Goliath is now outside the range of our experience, and this makes everything else, the past and the future, and, not least of all, David himself, less secure. David feels this acutely. We are watching him understand and resist a new truth, that revenge had given Goliath the edge, that the moment you execute your enemy, he escapes and slips into another dimension where he can see more than you can, or that in the absence of an afterlife, their biography has closed and therefore is no longer alterable. This must be why tyrants prefer to imprison and keep alive their most ardent adversaries. They know that, like Goliath here, the dead's last argument is their silence. Why else does David's face hint at remorse? Perhaps killing Goliath had earned him a new sympathy. It is not that Caravaggio's David regrets his victory, but rather that the magnitude of his act, the scale of his accomplishment, of extinguishing another man's life, has become for him, and perhaps for the first time in his young life, clear and conceivable. He finally knows what it means to kill a man. Caravaggio's David, very much like Lorenzetti's Lady Justice, is both acting and remembering his actions in a faraway place. Given war's trap that one of the two sides must lose, David, as well as being David, must now also become Goliath. He must be both killer and killed. By removing his enemy, he must now contend with how to fill the gap, the empty space where once stood the body of Goliath. And perhaps this is why the dark practice of decapitation has returned in recent years. I wonder if, beyond the obvious motives of a beheading to deal the enemy a final blow by separating their head from their body and therefore not affording them a dignified burial, to make a prize and an example of the fallen, to dislocate and fragment a person's body in the hope that that would disfigure their ideas, beliefs, and memory, there may be, lying beneath all these, a deeper desire, that beside being an act of final punishment and desecration, a beheading is also an expression of the private impulse literally to take the place of one's adversary, to carry their head above and occupy the place where their body had once stood, to walk where their feet had once trodden. Nicolas Poussin understood this. In his The Triumph of David, which hangs in London's Dulwich Picture Gallery, he depicts David entering Jerusalem, carrying with some effort on a thick wooden stick the heavy head of Goliath. Poussin opts for a theatrical scene. His David is wet-lipped and naive, surrounded by the admiring and the curious, as well as by those caught unawares. One mother sheltering her children behind her back, another excitedly encouraging her boy to look on. Like an incredulous young athlete, Poussin's David has yet to stomach his unlikely victory and its implications. Held high above him, Goliath's grey face is both that of the captive, but also of the captivated. For he appears to be, in the silence of his death and in the inner gaze of his large shut eyes, caught in the throes of some deep feeling, some terrible but noble dream. And the way Poussin chooses to position David's and Goliath's heads, one on top of the other, or one, David's, inside, seeming to have emerged from inside the other, Goliath's, further advances this hypnotic correspondence between the two men. It is as though they are both one and the same person, but at different points in his trajectory, or that they are, perhaps, father and son. By contrast, Caravaggio's David stands alone. His business with Goliath is a private affair. Nothing but darkness surrounds them. This is the intimacy of adversaries, which is equal in its intensity with that of lovers. David's blade, lean and clean and shiny, rests on his thigh, just above the groin. Why? What is that detail supposed to mean? Why the close proximity between David's blade and David's penis? Perhaps at the moment of murdering Goliath, David fathomed the extent of his desire, had understood the true scale of his own passion, and that something about this had unsettled him. Perhaps the moment he ended his opponent's life, David was overcome by the temptation, now forever thwarted, to try to see things through Goliath's eyes. Perhaps at the moment David understood the fault, that because of the adamance of our beliefs and passions, each one of us must live restricted by his or her own perspective, and that this has something to do with redemption, that our redemptive instinct is found in our unequivocal sympathy for our enemy, and that to be a man is to live in the constant unresolvable tension of these two poles. Away from the extremes of enemies, a similar desire exists between friends and lovers, perhaps more intensely between old friends and old lovers. Maybe my desire to see the green beside the Sant'Andrea al Quirinale, or Lorenzetti's fresco, or Caravaggio's painting, or life itself, through Diana's eyes, is the expression of my hunger to achieve, in the words of my Tripoli friend, complete conquest over her, and to resolve once and for all the mystery of her consciousness. But perhaps it's not that at all, but rather the expression of my redemptive instinct, my unequivocal sympathy for her, my desire to be inked by her and therefore momentarily escape the confines of my own existence. Only love and art can do this. Only inside a book or in front of a painting can one truly be let into another's perspective. It has always struck me as a paradox how, in the solitary arts, there is something intimately communal, and it suddenly became doubtful to me as we lay in Rome, as indeed it was now standing in the Sala di Nove in Siena, whether I would have written anything or could ever write anything if I had never loved. Implicit in the act of creation is praise, of discovering and naming the world, of acknowledging it, of saying it exists. The French artist André Cartier-Bresson had once described taking a photograph as saying yes. Not the yes of approval, but that of acknowledgement. In the end, as it is in the beginning, love and art are an expression of faith. How else to function with the limited knowledge we have? Asked if he was a pessimist, the English playwright Edward Bond replied, "Why am I talking to you if it is not a gesture of hope?" Lorenzetti's Allegory, Caravaggio's David, and indeed the entire history of art can be read as that, a gesture of hope and also of desire, a playing out of the human spirit's secret ambition to connect with the beloved, to see the world through her eyes, to traverse that tragic private distance between intention and utterance, so that finally we might be truly comprehended, and to do this not in order to advocate a position, but rather to be truly seen, to be recognized, not to be mistaken for someone else, to go on changing while remaining identifiable by those who know us best. Lying on the grass in Rome, Diana placed a hand on my thigh and sat up. Her back suddenly seemed an extensive and sweeping geography in the luminous and open day. The places where she had been, my stomach and chest, the spot on my side where her hand was resting, all felt cool and exposed. "What a beautiful place," she said. I came up on my elbows. I feared she might stand up and say, "I'm thirsty," or "What shall we do next?" or "Come on, let's go." She looked out at the people passing by. Someone had been watching us all along. A man, about my age, sitting on a bench on the opposite side of the green. I wondered how we appeared to him. Perhaps Diana too was thinking the same. But then she lay back down again, and her body found the exact places where it had been before. And in that moment, this seemed miraculous. Okay, thank you. Thanks. Yes.
So these can go anywhere. These can go 6 inches below. Just these can go here. This one's going to go here. This one goes just right there. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful reading. There may be some of you who have had the opportunity to read this book, but it just came out this past week, right? Yes. So if you haven't, I encourage you eagerly to do so. Maybe I would start by asking you about this theme of recognition, of being seen, of being known. It's something that comes up in this book. It's also something that comes up in The Return. And you write about when you were reunited with your cousins and uncles, feeling recognized. I think you used the verb. And it's something I mentioned in my introduction with regard to art. But what role does it play in your? What is it for you? What is that?
I mean, it just seems to me that, also it's not, you really, you shouldn't really dwell on yourself, right? So there's that, but there's also the fact that it seems obvious to me that it is also, to some extent, impossible to really know yourself. It's a terrible phrase, but to sort of have a measure of who you are. It seems to me there's an interesting impossibility there, right? That whatever you do, you're going to
blindness and insight,
right? Yeah.
Right? Some combination.
Therefore, it seems that our relationship to things and people are occasions for various sides of us to be illuminated or teased out. And this is, I mean, I'm stealing this idea because this is an idea that Proust has, no? This idea that that Proust proposes the idea that the whole purpose of social relations is that they can bring out in you, they can illuminate to you who you might be, and those things that you might be are also mobile. So it's a space of great instability but also vibrancy, and maybe there's a mercy to it, because also knowing yourself seems to me also a problem. Like, what if you could imagine this another option where you could actually pin yourself perfectly? That also seems not particularly interesting. And so one of the things that art does, I think, is that, right? It's also like those really fine social engagements, with a certain people that you feel get you or open something in you or make certain things in you possible. I've always found that very interesting. I'm sure as everybody here, people that are just objectively very interesting, but they don't make you interesting.
No, there are people, and
Yeah.
there are people you've like, wow, I'm boring with that person.
Yes.
And that doesn't feel good.
And then there are other people where you are somehow more, right? Yeah. So I think it's something around, something there somehow, something. And I think the works of art that I'm showing, I'm not necessarily, of course, arguing that they are objectively exceptional, although I do think they're exceptional.
Yeah.
But they are but they're also they occupy certain moments, in moments of revelation or moments of. They're really conversations, I think. That's also why I keep going back to the same things, and I do a lot of rereading, because I like the extended conversation with these works.
That evolves.
Yeah. I don't, I think. Sorry, I'm digressing, but there is. We do function sometimes under the assumption that the point is to exact a mastery on a painting or a book. Like, you read it in order to, and I think I'm much more interested in what sort of possibilities of engagement with it might be available. It's on some level collaborative, I think.
So did you? I mean, you write about the fact that Siena that these artworks had long been very important to you.
Yes. Yeah.
And that you went there as if to Mecca or something. We went and Siena actually lived up to your expectations. It did not disappoint you.
It did. I hope I'm not offending anyone. I really dislike Tuscany. I think Tuscany is it's self-satisfied. It's not. I'm very much a southerner, so take me to Naples, take me to these places. Palermo, that's where I come alive. Or Rome, maybe. And Rome is all too north. Like, that's the edge. Beyond Rome, no. So I have a very southern sensibility in this way. But I also genuinely think those are interesting places. Tuscany is very, staid. But I've had this unusual, inexplicable attraction to these paintings from a very young age. Well, not very young. I was about 19 when I first saw them. And, I come from a different world and a different tradition, because their paintings are mostly about, not the one I showed you, but a lot of the Sienese paintings are, iconographic Christian paintings, right? And so they just seemed foreign in a lot of ways, temporally foreign, but also the subjects for a lot of the references I didn't know, and they're very easy to misread as paintings for prayer, right? Whereas I think what's really interesting about them is that it's clear that those people, Duccio, Simone Martini, Lorenzetti, all that group stretching 200 years, were really interested in human life. They're interested. So they'll paint the mother and child, but they seem, to me at least, to be thinking, what is it like to be a mother? What is
Right.
it like to be a child? That child and that mom. What is that like? You know, and so they're thinking about human life in a wider sense. And so I found them very, very curious, and I couldn't explain to myself or to anyone why I kept returning to those paintings, because they certainly weren't cool, right? They weren't the cool paintings, at least in the time when I was in my 20s. You know, the cool paintings were others. You go, I don't know, Scream, that's a cool painting. And so I sort of sustained this interest in them for a long time. And the deeper the interest became, the less able I was to explain it to myself, and the more my relationship to Siena became complicated. It's not a relationship because I've never been there, So I said, but I mean, I didn't want to go. I thought I'll save it for when I have a good stretch of time that I can go and spend time there. And you're right, it did live up to it, because it's. I think, this is to me, I don't know the reason for this, but I think there is something that happens in certain encounters that we have with books, with people, with cities, that it is reliant on some kind of trajectory, on some kind of curated sort of time movement. That if you meet that book or that person at the wrong moment, things are not going to come alive. But you meet them at the right moment, something occurs, and I think that happened for me there. And the city it lent itself to me. It became available and full of resonance. And I felt, it's sort of the best sort of relationship. I felt flattered by it, and I believed that it was flattered by my interest. It was sort of, it was very dynamic, and I didn't know whether I could have that sustained for a month, but I did. It was very, very, very really interesting place.
You also write. I mean, you went there after you finished writing The
Yes,
Return.
yeah.
And you write about it as a place that you realized in one moment when you were when you were in the cemetery that you went there to grieve alone.
Yes, I went in that window of time between finishing The Return and before it was published. So when it was still a kind of private act.
Sort of liminal,
right? Yeah.
sort of hiatus moment.
Yeah, and those moments are very, I think, with time, I find them more and more interesting, and one should savor them, because there are those moments when you are in some way, you are excited, relieved, exhausted by by completing the book, but it's not somehow, it doesn't somehow exist, right, in the public,
outside.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I went there thinking I was just doing something pleasurable, because I had made a commitment 2 years before then. This is all very private, but I made a commitment to pleasure. I thought I should take my pleasure very seriously. Because it turns out I wasn't. I would just, when pleasure turns up, I'll enjoy it, but I wasn't determined about my pleasure. And I thought, this is nonsense. I should be more determined about my pleasure. So I thought, well, I'm going to go do something pleasurable. And when you're in your mid-40s, knowing what where your pleasure is a complicated business, And so I thought, after lots of crazy ideas, I decided to go to Siena because of these paintings that I've been interested in. But whilst I was there, I realized that on some level, I must have known that this would be the right space for me to attend to an event that was happening very slowly, which is the inevitable sort of realization that my father is dead, but also that I won't be able to find him. Or the chances of me finding my father's remains or how he died at that stage became very, very slim. And the difficulty with this kind of fate is there's no marker. There's no grave, there's no date. It's very vague. And so, in a sense, I think Siena became my marker. My time there, became sort of the marker where I genuinely sort of allowed myself to comprehend that fact. And maybe it's my temperament, but I needed to be alone for that. That was, that was. But I wasn't. It turns out alone because of the paintings, and because of the various people that I meet there, and who lend themselves in one way or another to my thinking.
Your thinking. I mean, I was struck because there's a moment in The Return where you write that you realized suddenly when you got to Libya that you had spent all your life since you had left there at the age of 8 waiting.
Yes.
And I wondered whether there has been a passage now into a different phase of life where you are no longer waiting. And I was thinking, it's a while since I was in college, so just a few minutes. But I have, there's certain courses that that you took that you retain something from, believe it or not. And I took a course on Tristan and Isolde with a professor named Claire Nouvet, and it was all about doubt, la doute, and it was precisely about the predicament that you spent 21 years in. I mean, in Tristan and Isolde, it's the king does not know whether Tristan and Isolde are having a love affair. He suspects it, but he doesn't know, and he seeks certainty, and he relentlessly seeks certainty, and every time he thinks he's certain, another doubt comes. And in The Return, you write about how hope had been seeping from you. There were only a few scattered grains left, and yet a few scattered grains is still hope.
Troublesome.
Is still hope, and so I suppose I wondered. Whether this book, in that sense, that time of grieving, these artworks, whether that marked for you possibly a passage away from waiting, and whether that was an acceptance, if so, whether that was an acceptance of uncertainty, or whether it was a different sort of experience.
Yes, no, I don't think that's totally inaccurate. I mean, it happened before, though. I mean, I think this. This private matter of taking my pleasure seriously is part of it. It's also because the thing about waiting is that, and I mean waiting literally, is not as a metaphor here, is that it sort of poisons everything with a certain sort of level of. Everything becomes contingent. Everything becomes susceptible to alteration or delay.
Right.
All the time.
Right.
And it could dilute your commitment to pleasure, but also your commitment to everything else.
Right. Your whole life.
Yeah.
Everything.
And so, yes, I think there was a moment of kind of something less passive, more active, and maybe also, this might sound a bit strange, but also maybe also a little bit more playful, a bit more experimental with the things that were around. I work very hard, and I don't mean that to say I don't enjoy. I love working. I love being engaged in things. So the idea of someone like me going to Siena for a month without any project,
Huge, right.
without anything, I wasn't writing anything for anyone. I wasn't working on anything. Was very unusual, and it sort of, I think, confirmed to me that the good sense in that, So it was. I don't mean just the book, but I mean the pleasure of it.
But it's interesting because you also you committed to it with dare one say, a slightly OCD, so that when you were invited to visit a friend, you felt you were cheating on your date with Siena.
Yes,
Yeah.
it was. Well, it got very concentrated, the atmosphere. There were days when I didn't hear my voice. I liked those days, and So there was something that was building up that I was a little bit reluctant about, breaking and going to a party. But yes.
But,
So
but you survived.
oh,
And
nearly.
and the experience survived, right?
Yes, yeah.
Right. You have spoken about the fact that you started with architecture, but you started with music, perhaps, and that music. I love when you've said, music is the thing in itself, unlike language, which is always a translation. Music is itself.
Yeah, not always, but it can be.
It can be.
Yes, yeah.
So I'm curious about. I'm curious about how the visual arts fit into a sort of taxonomy of experience for you,
Yes.
whether they are closer to one thing or another, closer to music, closer
Yes.
to language, and what the difference is for you, what it is that
Yeah.
you find in a Caravaggio that you don't find in a poem, or
Yeah.
vice versa.
Yes, I think we all suffer our prejudices, right? And this is one of mine, which is that I'm really I find it very difficult to not, and I'm not proud of this. This is not something I'm proud of, but I find it very difficult to not think less of someone who has absolutely no interest in music, or absolutely or who thinks. I have one of my dear friends. I'm not going to say who he is, but he's one of the finest writers I know. He's a wonderful writer, very imaginative, very smart. But he thinks music is decoration. He thinks music is just there to make people feel better, and that was really the only stupid thing he's ever said, But this is that.
He knows now.
He knows,
knows what you
No,
think
he
now.
No, I've told him this already. We're close enough that we can say that to each other. So I'm stating the obvious here, that these things are all important. But I also think, actually, they are part of my shock when I discovered that somebody who has such a refined sense of literature has absolutely no interest in music or painting, is because they seem to me very, very connected. They seem to be languages. And their epistemology allows them different access, different gestures of fluency, and so I go to them for that. I'm not saying they're but I think one of the great artists of our time is a Polish pianist and conductor, Krzysztof Zimmerman, with one M, Zimmerman, and he thinks. And he says this thing that is very curious, and I think is very true. He says music. He gets a little bit uncomfortable when people put too much stress on the phonics, on this new system of recording, and this, because he thinks it all misses the point. Or pianists, they get overtly anxious about the piano. Sviatoslav Richter used to say, the wonderful Russian pianist Sviatoslav Richter used to say that your piano is your fate. You never choose it. You just turn up and play whatever piano's there. And Krzysztof Zimmerman says that music is not notes. That's not what music is. Music uses notes so as to discover the shape of the human soul. That's what it's doing. It's the fact that it's notes is just beside the point. That there is something else called music that isn't notes. That I find so very interesting, and I think it's true with literature. I think literature is not words or the library. Literature is something else that words and the library are trying to get at, or trying to attend to. So it's not that there are different languages that are translating the same thing, but that they have a different approach, a different mode, a different philosophy maybe. They have a sense, painting thinks about the world in a certain way, in a certain attitude, with certain curiosities. It's stupid to generalize painting. Well, it's a whole world of it. But, the other thing that I find interesting about it is that it's so explicit you know. So if you've seen this, if you just looked at that for 3 seconds, or if you looked at it for a lifetime, had it hanging in your home, who's to say whether you've seen it the first time or seen it? You know, it's so deceptive because it's there. It's got a very clear border. You've seen it, you know. So how to read something? And I'm somebody who's very interested in close reading, in literature, but also in music and the visual arts. I think close reading is the thing. I really do. I have a huge enthusiasm for it because I think it trusts interpretation, you know, and it's enthused by the different creative possibilities within interpretation, no? And I think that's just marvelous. And so the painting, I think, can cheat you with close reading because you can say, well, I've just seen it, you know. So I think how to look at a painting is also a question for me, which is why I keep returning in this kind of spastic way of mine, just going back to the same paintings all the time.
Just so you know, Hisham sometimes goes back every week for a year to look at the same painting.
I'm afraid that's a
He really
problem.
looks at the painting.
Yeah.
He really looks at the painting.
Yeah. Because I think it becomes what I was talking about earlier, that it becomes a kind of conversation. And it becomes a location, a place that you go that curates certain enthusiasms or ideas, introduces you to certain things that you might be thinking about. A bit like, you know, abbreviated version here with what I've done with these paintings. But over a long period of time, because they're mobile and you're mobile, you're changing. So there's a lot of that's also what I meant by it's a work in progress.
As you change, the experience changes. I want to open it to questions, but before I just, one last.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So this is something that you wrote, there's a piece you wrote in The Guardian, I guess 2016 maybe. But this relates to speaking of different languages. I am a Libyan who writes in English. I write in a language my father did not wish me to write to him in. Yet the most consistent response to this fate has not been sorrow or unease or shame or, for that matter, pride. Even the obligation to justify myself is slowly leaving me. What remains is a writer's devotion to his craft and the daily occupation to express the soul's 3 chambers, memory, curiosity, and will. Even during the years when I struggled with this question of writing in a language that was not my own, or a language that once had not been my own, a language, in other words, I had to make mine, I never worried about it when I wrote. Such doubts and confusion come only when I'm stuck or depressed or lost or inarticulate, as though the issue is connected to expression, as though the question of what language to write in gains its potency from the risk of running out of things to say. Now, I'm sorry, because there's like an hour of stuff to talk about in there. We don't have an hour because I know I want people to, but I wanted to ask you about that, you know, when you say I don't even justify it to myself anymore, that passage into you say, I guess maybe it's elsewhere, but or did I just read it aloud? You know, a little confused. But that it has become the language in which you remember the life before, or in which you talk about the life before. Yeah. That the memories weren't lived in that language, but that's what you write in. And I guess we were speaking earlier in the day about the experience of when writing's going well and how it's, you know, this extraordinary aliveness. But I'm wondering about your relation to language and the I'm still wondering about that translation question. Mm-hmm. It's not very articulately expressed.
No, it's, I just don't know what to say. I mean, I think one of the things that I was worried about early on when it was clear that I am an English language writer, or a writer that writes in English, one of the things that I was worried about that it would somehow distance me from some of the things that I care a lot about, right? My experience, my country, my family, my people, although you're also all people are my people too, but in this very intimate way, I worried about it, and I think about that still, because there are certain words that you cannot. I mean, maybe
Can't
all
translate.
words you can't translate, but there are certain words that are just filled with so much resonance, that are very local. So it continues to be it continues to be an issue, but there are other ways that I have implicated myself into relationships of intimacy with those things, with places and people. I think in moments like this, sorry to be very specific, but in moments like this, where my country and my part of the world is so tormented and fractured and filled with complexity. These are countries that are very easy to give up.
Give up as in walk away from? Or?
Yes, I mean, it's convenient to give up. And so, and there are good reasons sometimes. You want to say something, and it's going to complicate your access. These are very, very tricky things to speak about quickly. But I feel very committed over time. I've discovered that it's exactly when you feel you don't want to go is when you should go, because they're so rich, And then you fall into this strange place of how your places are spoken about from the outside. And then you go and you discover the pleasures, the exquisite pleasures of them. Even when there is a war and there is conflict, there is just a lot of energy and delight and inventiveness, and love and exuberance. And so the question of language, there's a lot of things to say about it, but one of the things, the concerns I had is how it might thwart or limit this
That
desire
connection.
to engage. Who's to say? Maybe it has, maybe it hasn't. But I definitely discovered there are other ways that one could remain close.
Do you translate, or do you, when you're to the Arabic versions?
My own work? No.
But
no.
do you go over? You go
Yes,
over
I
them
do
and
go
make
over
sure
them,
that
and
they-
it's a terrible process. It's very upsetting. It's very upsetting. I somehow had a fantasy in the early days that when the book is translated into Arabic, I almost said back into Arabic, it would somehow return to its because it's like any translation. It's another. It belongs to someone else.
Yeah.
Someone, all those words weren't chosen by you; they were chosen by someone else. And also I discovered that my ear is far more nuanced and
Then you realized.
in English than in
Oh,
Arabic. It's
I
just my English language is better. So you're confronted both with the usual problems of translation into any language, but also with the added level that you cannot be as useful to it. But this is the negative. The positive side is that its translation is a wonderfully collaborative process, and it's not, as our culture, I think, treats it, when you look how little we pay our translators, as some kind of machine that you put text on one side, comes out in another language there. But it's art. It's a very high art, actually. And if you're blessed to have somebody, a true artist, work with your text, then it's wonderful. I learned that very quickly, but in the beginning I wanted it to be sort of a Xerox copy of my soul, but in Arabic, and it didn't work. The Xerox copy came out all smudged. And
The complexities.
yeah.
Thank you. Well, I think we should turn and open it to you guys, and if people have some questions, we have a little time. Over here. Oh, did I do something? Sorry.
Hiya. So the theme of revisiting things, so almost like rereading and coming back.
Hold it nice and close.
So rereading and coming back to something and it being like a conversation. when you're drafting your own work and then redrafting and coming back to it, is that also a conversation?
Yes, I suppose so. It also, I mean, it depends on the stage. You know, for me, at least in the beginning, there's with every book, there's a moment. It usually happens sort of quarter of the way in, or a third of the way in, or if you're unlucky, half the way in. There's a moment when the book establishes itself and its character, and you know, I do very much. You know, I do think books are our fate. You know, they're not only, and also the paintings we engage with are our fate, but the sort of, in the sense that you know, the choice seems to me very limited on what one should write, right? At least in my case, it's not like I have sort of an array of books. Oh, should I write this one or that one, or which one should I? You know, there's a choice, but the choice is limited. And so the point then becomes, how do you close read the book? You know, once you've got enough of it there, how do you lend your best self to it? Try to figure out what it is, what it wants, what its appetites are, what its mode, its character, the way it moves. You know, books do come with their tastes too. You know, with their and they have their likes and dislikes. They have situations where you put them and they'll become stiff, and other situations where they're very expressive, or maybe giddy and silly, or you know, there's a range, you know, and I love that moment. It's a moment when maybe this is a bit of a prosaic example, but you know those very good parents, you know, that could be sort of, they don't indulge the child and spoil them, but they aren't also so, you know, harsh. They create the right atmosphere for the child's nature to sort of come alive and express itself, you know. So in that, the very sort of, so there's a very certain kind of close reading or rereading before that you get to that. After that, what I really appreciate about that moment, and if you ask me, really the thing that I love most about this work is that, more than anything else. I mean, I'm delighted when somebody I appreciate and respect and admire says such wonderful things about my work. It moves me, genuinely does. But I think at the center of my true sort of delight when it comes in my relationship to my work is that moment when you become the servant, when the book says, okay, this is what I want, now this is what you need to do, you know. And you're still bewildered with doubt, and you're still wondering, and every day you're still haunted by these confusions, and but you do feel employed, you know. You know, you feel oddly useful, also knowing that nobody needs this, like the world will continue. But you feel
also
somehow
nobody else can do it, right? That it isn't,
Yes.
it isn't something that if you walk away, it won't be done.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So.
Thank you, Professor Matar, and for the talk and for your work. If you all will forgive me and you'll indulge me, Professor, in the interest of this collaborative work of, you know, this kind of craft and artwork, when I read The Return before I read your novel, and it created a ripple of change in my life that's probably imperceptible in my consciousness and my thinking. It created a practical change in my life that I wanted to share with you, if you'll allow me, which is that, and I don't know how much you will relate to this or the people in this room will relate to this, but I'm begging your indulgence. When I recite Quran, I send it to certain departed souls, which is a practice and after reading The Return, I felt compelled to include your father in that. And that's a kind of maybe ripple in the world that you might not be aware of, or I don't know if somebody said this to you before, but it exists, so I wanted to share it with you. When I read your novel, this feeling of mutual kind of understanding was so acute for me that I couldn't read more than like a page or two at a time. I had to kind of step away and come back and step away and come back, because whatever space it was that it put me in, it was viscerally painful. It was a painful reading experience, which is not to say that it wasn't an excellent work, but it was difficult. And I wanted to know, in this idea of like mutual understanding, if the work of writing for the writer is getting that thing on the page, right, that thing which is not the words or the library, and the work of the reader is seeing it, is there anything beyond this that you as a writer want from your readers? Because perhaps I can say that in reading your novel I experienced that, but I wanted to do more, and I didn't know what. So I'm wondering, as a writer, what do you want from your... Is there anything you want from us?
It's a beautiful question. Beautiful question. I'm really touched by what you said. Thank you. So I think the baseline is I don't know. But possibly the thing that I want is the thing that I get from books that have marked me. So I see writing very much as, you know, in the pre-Renaissance there was this lovely idea that you write a book, you don't put your name on it, you just put it on the shelf. So you write for the shelf, you know. And I love this idea. So as a way to contribute, to give back to the shelf that has given you so much. So writing in that sense also, I think. But also, you know, those books that have marked me, they sort of, they allowed me occasions to recognize myself, to find myself in the most unlikely places, you know. And I felt connected. I don't mean just socially, like I'm not alone, but I felt honored, you know. I'm very moved by the experience of being a human being. And I'm moved by it because it's so phenomenal and intense, and it's filled with great sorrow and great joy, and it's the one thing I'm most ashamed of, and it's the one thing that I'm most proud of. You know, it is just to me, I can't get over. You know, I haven't quite gotten over yet being a human being, in those moments, in those books, I feel attended to, you know, and those are, I think, maybe our culture hasn't quite understood the significance of this, because I think it's got to be at the heart of anything to do with whatever interpretation of progress we might have, you know, moments when you are attended to, where you find yourself in the lives of others, where your sense of the world expands, you know, where so maybe, you know, in some wildly ambitious way, I'm hoping that, maybe, or delusional way, you know, I'm hoping that I might give that pleasure to others as I have been given it by so many, you know, on some level. But I you know, beyond that, I don't know. Yeah, don't know. Yeah.
We have time for just one more question. So,
Thank you very much. I actually have two quick questions. The first one is, sorry,
Hey, found out by
very
now.
quick, very quick.
You found out by now I'm very Arabic. I give very long answers.
I'm very Arabic too, so, you know. So you said that you went to Siena and you didn't plan on writing a book, that you had no obligation. So I was wondering what prompted you to write this book. Was it a moment? Was it something that happened? Why you felt you needed to get this on the page? The second question is that disappearances don't disappear, but they might morph into something else. You've explored the disappearance in several books. Have those voices, have those questions that prompted you to get those issues on the page now been quietened, or do you still have more to say about it? Thank you.
You know, when I was in Siena, I kept a diary, but I didn't. I really didn't plan to write anything. And I started writing another book, and a book that I've been thinking about for a long time, actually. And so I felt I wanted to get to it, and was making way into that book. And every 3 months or so, I would open those diaries and read them, because part of me doubted the experience. I thought, no, it wasn't that special, really. It was just, and I would read them and think, no, there's really something here. Maybe one day, I don't know, maybe I'll employ it in another book. Maybe it will be part of something else. Maybe it will be, I had no idea, but I just thought that's, a year or so into this, I felt I got my teeth into this novel that I was writing. And we were going back to Siena, first time going back to Siena after this intense month there. And I was going in a very happy, sociable setting with Diana and some of our closest, dearest friends, going there for 3 days to misbehave. And we went to Siena, and I felt, because I had been the only one that had sort of knows it a bit, I sort of slightly was playing guide, taking them to the places that I discovered and so on. And I realized that it's as if this mist was going over that Siena that I thought was preserved in those diaries. It was something. I thought, no, this has a sell-by date on it. I won't have the same vividness if I leave it too much. A combination of that and a combination of the feeling that on the way to Siena, this time with friends, and a year of working on this new book, I had given my first and most critical reader, my wife, the first 60 pages of this book. So she hadn't read anything of this, I guess. And we were on the plane. This was terrible for me, because I'm sitting on the plane, she's reading, and I'm just fretting. I'm trying to pretend that she's not reading and misreading every certain. If she moves like this, oh no, it's not. So, and then by the end, she reads it, and she really felt very passionate about it and positive about it. So I somehow felt that maybe it's well enough that I could leave it for a bit and spend a few months writing Siena, or trying to write it and having a go. So that's what happened. When I came back to the novel, it took about 3 months for it to agree. It was as if it was, who do you think I am? What, I think I just said, waiting for you? I felt that a bit.
So when is it coming?
The novel?
Yes.
Well, I'm still working. I'm still working. And the second question was, yes. Well, I don't know. All I know is what I never really have at least a clear intention of what it is that I want to write next. And I'm writing this book. I can see a book after it. It's usually like that. I just see, and usually that moment I described, when you get to a book when you get to the stage in the book where the book sort of establishes its authority, with lack of a better expression, it often happens with me that's the moment I see something beyond it I want to do, another book. It's as if part of your brain has been released. You can be thinking about something else. So that's where I am. I don't have a project. I don't have a sense of my own work. The way my work is described oftentimes makes sense to me and also doesn't. I don't think my work is really about Libya or about my family or about my life. I can see why it seems that way, and maybe it is, but in my mind it isn't. So I am the worst person to. I'm definitely not the authority, on the work. So yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Hisham. And